The instant I stepped onto Flight 317, I felt the air thicken with unspoken dread. I'd just finished a grueling 2-week business trip, and all I wanted was to sleep during the flight home. Yet from the moment I boarded, a strange tension pulsed through the cabin. At the gate, 2 passengers had argued in hushed, frantic tones. Then, without warning, they vanished before check-in. A flight attendant flipped through paperwork, muttering that her passenger list was missing more names. As I settled into C-12A, I could almost taste the anxiety in the recycled air. I glanced around. The other passengers looked equally drained, some hunched over phones, some dozing, some fidgeting. Across the aisle sat a tall, pale man in a crumpled suit. His eyes were bloodshot, as though he'd been awake for days. Behind me, 2 children bickered, their mother's exhausted sigh punctuating every sentence. A strange hush fell when the pilot announced our imminent departure, and overhead lights flickered just for an instant, enough to set my nerves on edge. I told myself it was only travel fatigue, but as we taxied down the runway, a voice crackled over the plane's intercom, not the pilot's voice, but a garbled, static-laced whisper that sounded unnervingly like, "They're here." I jerked upright, heart pounding. No one else seemed to notice. The engines roared, and we took off into a bright autumn sky, leaving the airport behind in seconds. I've always been prone to fierce jet lag, so I tried to force myself into sleep. It took hold, briefly, until a violent jolt roused me. One moment, I was drifting through half-formed dreams of a looming shape in the clouds. The next, luggage rained from overhead, and passengers shrieked. The plane pitched so steeply I felt weightless. Chaos erupted, oxygen. Masks dropped with mechanical precision, seatbelts yanked tight, and the lights blinked frantically. "What's happening?" I shouted to the woman beside me. She clutched her armrests, eyes squeezed shut in terror, offering no response. I fumbled for my own mask and forced trembling hands to secure it. Outside the window, the tops of tall conifers rushed upward far too close. A desperate calm broke over me. "This is it. We're going down." The impact smashed my thoughts into oblivion. All I knew was the screech of tearing metal, the deafening roar of engines, and a sensation of being flung through darkness. When I opened my eyes again, the world was sideways. Muffled cries and hissing steam filled the air. For a moment, I wondered if I was dead, but pain radiated from my shoulder and knees, sharp and immediate. I lay near the plane's aisle, surrounded by scraps of baggage and food trays. Through a massive crack in the fuselage, I saw a forest, so close that shattered branches jutted inside. The cabin lay in ruin, seats twisted at wild angles, windows blown out. Yet my first coherent thought was, I survived. Crawling through the wreckage, I pushed myself upright, ignoring the throbbing in my limbs. Survivors moaned nearby. A man with a bloody gash on his forehead tugged at an overhead compartment, as if searching for supplies. A flight attendant knelt over a young woman, checking her pulse. I spotted 5 or 6 others, shaky but alive. The rest lay still, broken or pinned under debris. "We need to help the injured," someone shouted. His name, I later learned, was Mitch. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a deep, urgent voice. I joined him, mustering a semblance of first aid knowledge. We freed 2 passengers from a crushed row of seats, but a man, pinned by a metal pipe in his gut, begged for death. Mitch, white-faced, eventually obliged. With a hatchet, an image that will forever haunt me, the survivors around us turned away, choking on grief and revulsion. "We need to help the injured," someone shouted. His name, I later learned, was Mitch. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a deep, urgent voice. I joined him, mustering a semblance of first aid knowledge. We freed 2 passengers from a crushed row of seats, but a man, pinned by a metal pipe in his gut, begged for death. Mitch, white-faced, eventually obliged. With a hatchet, an image that will forever haunt me. The survivors around us turned away, choking on grief and revulsion. Only half a dozen of us remained in this part of the plane. Me, Mitch, a woman named Amber, a younger woman called Linda, still in shock over her sister's mangled body, and 2 men, Will and Norton. We pried open the door to the cockpit, finding it caved in by a tree trunk, no sign of the pilot or co-pilot. All that remained was a faint crackle from the damaged radio. Through static, we heard something that sounded like a hiss, then a single, garbled word. Late. We had no idea who was speaking or what it meant. Amber fiddled with her phone, searching for signal. Nothing. Our best option was to stay put. Conventional wisdom dictated that rescue teams would look for the plane wreckage first. But deep down, I sensed something was terribly wrong beyond the mere crash. Outside, we set up a row of bodies under makeshift shrouds. The ground was too hard for graves, so we covered the deceased in blankets. Linda wept as she placed her sister's belongings on the inert form, a grim farewell. Mitch and I scoured the wreck for anything salvageable: first aid kits, clothes, water bottles. Norton suggested building an SOS sign with rocks in the clearing behind the plane, and Will helped him. Night descended with startling speed, and the forest exhaled a chilly breath. We used suitcases to barricade the gaping tear in the fuselage, trying to block out the wind. Huddling inside, we rationed the meager airline snacks, each of us lost in private horror. Overhead, the sky remained too overcast to see stars. A creeping dread took hold when the usual chirping insects fell silent. By midnight, everyone but me had drifted into uneasy slumber. That was when I heard a sharp snap from outside. My mind conjured the possibility of a bear, or maybe a desperate survivor. I slid aside the luggage and slipped out with a flashlight. The darkness was absolute. I turned in a slow circle, heart in my throat. "Hello?" My voice sounded pitiful, absorbed by looming pines. Another snap. Then a dragging noise, soft and sinister. I followed it to the line of bodies. One blanket had been moved aside, leaving an empty space. A jolt of terror froze me. I swept the flashlight beam across the ground and found a trail of disturbed leaves, as though something had pulled a body away. At the edge of my flashlight's reach, I saw the corpse's legs vanish into darkness, tugged by a limb so black it seemed to absorb light. My eyes locked onto a pair of gleaming orbs. A brief, raspy shriek erupted, and the thing sped off, dragging the body with impossible speed. I stumbled back, almost dropping my flashlight, then fled into the fuselage. For the rest of that agonizing night, I crouched near the barricade, certain that any moment a clawed hand would reach in. Morning revelations. At dawn, the birds returned, singing as if nothing had happened. Mitch and Norton discovered the missing body, concluding an animal, perhaps a bear, had taken it. I struggled with what to say. The creature I glimpsed was no bear. It moved too fast, and those eyes. But I couldn't bring myself to share the story yet. I saw the exhaustion and fear etched on everyone's faces. They might think I was delirious. At dawn, the birds returned, singing as if nothing had happened. Mitch and Norton discovered the missing body, concluding an animal, perhaps a bear, had taken it. I struggled with what to say. The creature I glimpsed was no bear. It moved too fast, and those eyes. But I couldn't bring myself to share the story yet. I saw the exhaustion and fear etched on everyone's faces. They might think I was delirious. We turned to practicalities. We searched the plane for additional food, found a few scattered snack packs and bottled drinks. The water would last maybe a couple of days if we rationed. Linda stared at the stripped row of bodies, her traumatized silence more unsettling than tears. Around midday, Amber confessed she'd been having terrifying nightmares long before the crash. Nightmares about bright lights stalking the plane. Mitch admitted the same. Will recalled reading about strange lights in the region's air traffic reports. I revealed I'd heard something on the intercom the moment we took off. Even Norton, the most rational among us, couldn't ignore these coincidences. A current of the inexplicable tied us all together. That evening, Mitch and Will went to gather firewood, hoping a signal fire might help. Rescuers. The rest of us stayed near the wreck. By the time night fell, the men hadn't returned. We huddled close, tension prickling like static. Without warning, a disembodied hum reverberated through the forest. Then the high-pitched wail of a man in distress, followed by hurried footsteps. Will burst into the clearing, panting, "Open up! Let me in!" We shoved suitcases aside, and he collapsed inside, trembling. "It took him," he gasped, voice raw. "A light from above. Mitch is gone." He recounted the horror. They'd been collecting wood when an intense, silent glow swept across the treetops. Mitch froze under its beam, eyes rolling back. Will tried to pull him free, but a surge of energy knocked him down. By the time he scrambled to his feet, Mitch was nowhere to be seen. The light blinked out, leaving total darkness. The hair on my neck stood up. This matched Amber's nightmares, an otherworldly beam, capturing someone. Linda broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Norton, ashen-faced, kept muttering about rational explanations, but even he could barely maintain composure. Rescue seemed more distant than ever. Radio distortions. Night stretched on. We assigned watch shifts, though every sound outside made our hearts jolt. Sometime after midnight, the damaged cockpit radio crackled. I sat near it, dozing, and jolted awake to an eerie voice. It whispered, distorted and static-laden, "Help me!" I turned the volume up, beckoning the others. Linda looked on with wide eyes. Amber pressed the transmit button. "Mitch, is that you?" A pause. Then, "Not alone. They are hurting me." The final word disintegrated into a screech that forced us to cover our ears. Linda shrieked, and Amber slammed the radio off, tears streaming down her cheeks. Whether it was truly Mitch or a cruel mimic, I couldn't say. Either way, the helplessness was shattering. When dawn arrived, we mustered our courage. Norton, Will, and I ventured into the forest to look for Mitch. We tromped through dense underbrush, marking trees with torn bits of fabric, so we wouldn't get lost. Our compass spun uselessly. Phones flickered with odd static, as though caught in an electromagnetic field. At last, we stumbled upon a grim clearing. The remains of airplane seats and branches formed a grotesque structure, as if something had fashioned a crude lair. The stench of decay hung heavy. In the far corner lay Mitch. He wasn't shredded or devoured, but a cauterized hole gaped in his abdomen, as though inflicted by a high-intensity beam. His face was twisted in an expression of frozen terror. Will nearly collapsed in grief. Norton gagged at the sight. I scanned the shadows, half convinced the creature was lurking nearby. 1,000 questions bombarded my mind. Was this the same entity that dragged away the corpse? Or were multiple horrors at play, one in the sky, one on the ground? We rushed back to the wreck. Telling the others about Mitch's fate felt like plunging a knife into an open wound. Amber and Linda clung to each other, silent tears streaking their cheeks. With supplies running low and rescue nowhere in sight, despair settled in like a dense fog. That night, a storm broke overhead. Rain poured in sheets, thunder rattled the plains, battered walls. The fuselage took on water through every crack. We struggled to remain dry, setting out containers to collect rainwater. During a flash of lightning, I glimpsed a shape, prowling just beyond the barricade. A tall silhouette with elongated limbs, eyes reflecting pale fire. I shouted, but it vanished. The others saw nothing. We endured a relentless cycle of near silence interrupted by howling wind. Around midnight, the emergency lights flickered on, glowing a sickly orange. The radio hissed static again, babbling half-formed words in multiple voices. Some sounded human, pleading for help. Others were guttural, unearthly. A swirl of bright lights shimmered outside, weaving through the storm. Linda lost it then, screaming, "They're coming for us!" She tried to run out into the downpour, but we held her back, hearts pounding in terror. Smoke on the horizon. By morning, the storm had subsided. The forest glistened with fresh rain, but the sense of menace refused to dissipate. While rummaging for supplies, Amber noticed a thin thread of smoke in the distance. Could it be part of the plane's tail section? Another group of survivors? We debated the danger of leaving. Eventually, Will and I volunteered to investigate, while Amber stayed to look after Linda and Norton, who was limping from a sprained ankle. We set out with minimal gear, following the faint smoke column. After nearly 2 hours, we reached a scorched clearing. The plane's tail had crashed there, partially burned. Among the wreckage was a flight attendant named Serena, alive but frightened. She'd been trapped under debris for days and managed to start a small fire with emergency flares. Grateful for rescue, she followed us back, wincing with each step. Our group brightened slightly at her arrival. She had basic first aid knowledge, stabilizing Norton's ankle and checking Linda's vitals. Yet her expression darkened when she mentioned seeing dancing lights in the sky. She, too, suspected we weren't alone. Encounter with the unknown. Late that afternoon, as we prepared to hunt for more firewood, a deep hum vibrated the air. We stepped out to see an enormous, disc-like craft skimming above the canopy, almost blending with the gray clouds. Lighting flickered around it, silent yet ominous. In seconds, a dazzling beam cut through the treetops, scorching the ground. We sprinted back into the fuselage, hearts hammering. The beam swept across the clearing as if searching, then suddenly snapped off. The craft vanished into the clouds. Late that afternoon, as we prepared to hunt for more firewood, a deep hum vibrated the air. We stepped out to see an enormous, disc-like craft skimming above the canopy, almost blending with the gray clouds. Lighting flickered around it, silent yet ominous. In seconds, a dazzling beam cut through the treetops, scorching the ground. We sprinted back into the fuselage, hearts hammering. The beam swept across the clearing as if searching, then suddenly snapped off. The craft vanished into the clouds. The forest fell silent again, an uneasy truce. As the sun sank, a lavender haze settled between the pines. We stationed ourselves inside, with a small, makeshift fire near the fuselage to keep watch. The tension was unbearable. We had so many enemies, the UFO above some unnatural predator lurking in the trees, and our own deteriorating minds. Near midnight, a quake-like vibration rattled the plane. Bags tumbled, seats shifted. Serena and Amber shrieked from the cockpit area. I staggered forward, seeing bright flashes outside. Will and Norton unblocked the entrance to investigate. By the time we stepped out, the clearing churned with chaos. Dark, spindly shapes danced around the flickering fire, each with reflective eyes. One pinned Serena to the mud. She cried for help. Will lunged at it with a metal rod. The creature recoiled, letting out a series of bone-rattling clicks. Another seized Norton by the leg, yanking him off his feet. I grabbed a sharpened shard of aluminum and drove it into the thing's torso. It snarled, rearing back. In the wild glow of the fire, I glimpsed features that defied logic. Skeletal limbs covered in bristly hair, a face that combined spider-like eyes with a curved mouth bristling with teeth. Lightning flashed overhead, revealing more of them at the tree line, as if waiting to see if we'd succumb. Then a piercing shriek echoed through the clearing. The creatures abruptly turned and fled, disappearing into the forest at terrifying speed. Shaking, we dragged Norton into the fuselage. He'd been gashed by a set of needle-like claws. We couldn't stay outside. Slamming our luggage barricade closed, we realized how helpless we were. The UFO still prowled above, occasionally lighting up the sky. The forest creature, maybe multiple creatures, roamed at will. We were trapped, battered, and losing hope. Linda, near catatonic, just stared wide-eyed at nothing. Her sister was gone, Mitch was gone, and now the rest of us were on the verge of destruction. A terrifying lift. While we tried to tend to Norton's wound, a gut-wrenching lurch rocked the fuselage. The plane's nose tilted upward, as if something lifted the entire wreck. Crushed seats slid toward the rear, and water bottles rolled across the floor. Shouts erupted. Overhead, the craft's beam pierced the roof, causing sparks to shower. An almost magnetic force hoisted the fuselage into the air a few feet. Then it dropped, slamming back down with monstrous impact. The noise was deafening. Metal grinding, bones fracturing, windows exploding. I blacked out in the chaos. When I came to, the sun was rising through the battered fuselage. Dust motes drifted in the hazy light. Everything was eerily still, except for an occasional crack from warped metal. I found Amber lying against a torn seat, a deep gash on her forehead. She stirred when I touched her shoulder. Linda lay curled up, whimpering softly. Will limped into view, his left arm cradled against his side. Serena was half buried in debris but breathing. Norton wasn't moving. We rushed to free Norton, but it was too late. He'd been crushed by a metal beam, eyes blank, chest unmoving. Grief overwhelmed us, but we had no time to process it. The plane was torn wide open, and the forest loomed. We expected the creatures or the UFO to finish us off at any moment. We rushed to free Norton, but it was too late. He'd been crushed by a metal beam, eyes blank, chest unmoving. Grief overwhelmed us, but we had no time to process it. The plane was torn wide open, and the forest loomed. We expected the creatures or the UFO to finish us off at any moment. Vain hopes and grim reality. Time dragged like a wounded animal. Our supplies were nearly gone. I forced a few sips of water down Linda's throat, while Amber and Serena searched for anything edible. Will stood outside, scanning the skies. An hour later, he shouted for us. We stumbled out to see a formation of black helicopters overhead. My heart leapt with hope. Rescue had arrived. Though something in the way They maneuvered felt oddly deliberate, almost militaristic. They circled once, then descended. A team of uniformed men with no clear insignias jumped out, rifles raised. We stumbled forward, arms up, babbling about the crash, the creatures, the UFO. They ordered us onto the ground, administered injections, and everything faded into black. The next thing I remember was a white-walled medical room, and 4 in my arm, a headache pounding behind my eyes. A stern-faced official peppered me with questions about the crash, about lights, about the anomalies we witnessed. When I pressed him for answers, he offered only clipped responses. Days blurred together. I never saw the official again. Eventually, they declared me stable and free to go, insisting I'd suffered trauma-induced delusions, yet also warning me to avoid sharing my wild account. The official cause of the crash, they insisted, was mechanical failure amplified by a severe storm. I left with more questions than answers, shadows that linger. Over the next few weeks, I tried to locate the other survivors. Linda was reportedly transferred to a psychiatric facility. Amber vanished days after her release, her phone disconnected. Will called me once, his voice buzzing with static. The line went dead mid-sentence. Serena, no trace. I scoured the news for any mention of UFO sightings or forest creatures. Most outlets parroted the official story. Flight 317 went down due to engine trouble. Online conspiracy. Forums, however, buzzed about unidentified lights that day. A handful of locals claimed they saw black shapes prowling near the crash site, but no official statements backed them up. At night, my dreams returned me to that plane. We're plummeting, the engine's gone silent. I see shapes swirling in the clouds, lightning that flashes green, monstrous silhouettes crawling across the wings. I try to warn the others, but my voice is lost in a sickening rumble. Then I wake with a jolt, drenched in sweat, the memory of shining eyes imprinted in my mind. I avoid air travel now. Anytime I see a beam of light slicing through a cloudy sky, my pulse races. Whenever I see a shadow at the edge of a dark wood, my nerves jangle. The sense of being watched persists, as though they allowed us to live for reasons unknown. Sometimes I wonder if the UFOs are a separate force, or if they command the creatures on the ground. Or perhaps they're all one nightmare phenomenon, dissecting, observing, leaving us in pieces. A final warning. I write this in the hope that someone out there will pay attention. The official story is a fabrication. Flight 317 was brought down by an unidentified craft. Something in that forest hunts, feeding on fear, flesh, or both. The government, or an organization with government-level resources, intervened, took us away, then buried the truth. I write this in the hope that someone out there will pay attention. The official story is a fabrication. Flight 317 was brought down by an unidentified craft. Something in that forest hunts, feeding on fear, flesh, or both. The government, or an organization with government-level resources, intervened, took us away, then buried the truth. Should you ever find yourself in a remote woodland, with no cell reception and strange lights flickering above, remember this account. I was there. I felt the plane fail under a presence we couldn't comprehend. I heard the monstrous shrieks in the dark. I saw the beam that snatched a man into nothingness, and I witnessed inhuman shapes with bristling limbs stalking the perimeter, hungry for more. In some twisted sense, we survived the crash, but perhaps only as unwitting subjects to be observed before rescue came and hushed it all up. If you value your sanity, keep an eye on the sky, And never underestimate the nightmares that might dwell in the deepest parts of the forest. The roars you hear in the distance might not belong to ordinary animals. The beam you see overhead might be more than a trick of the light. When the wind moans through the trees and the forest grows unnaturally quiet, that's when you should run or brace for horrors that will haunt you long after you leave that patch of earth behind. We tried to warn the world about what truly lurks beyond normal comprehension. But if they won't listen, perhaps the next time those lights appear, new victims will tell us stories similar to ours, one that ends in broken metal, midnight screams, and a sense that the nightmare hovering above has only begun its dark work. I will never forget the sight of that monstrous hand dragging a corpse into blackness, nor the final, horrified expression on Mitch's face, a hole seared through his abdomen. I'll forever hear Norton's last gurgling breath, pinned beneath twisted wreckage. Their fate should serve as a beacon of caution. These forces can snuff out a life in an instant or toy with you for days, letting despair erode your will. Truth be told, I'm no longer certain of my future. The voices on the radio, the nightmares, the men in black uniforms, they all swirl in my psyche, a puzzle with only one solution. We encountered something beyond human understanding, and we lost. Surviving physically doesn't mean escaping unscathed. Our minds remain branded with glimpses of a larger, more terrifying reality. Even now, on quiet nights, I step onto my porch and peer skyward, searching for a faint, pulsing glow. Sometimes I sense I'll see it again, that disk merging with clouds. The forest behind my home rustles in the breeze, branches forming shapes that remind me of spindly arms. I can't say if it's all in my head or if they truly track me across the distances, waiting for a moment to strike. My only solace is that by sharing what happened, I might honor those we lost. Linda's sister, the flight crew, Mitch, Norton, countless unnamed passengers. Their lives ended in that forest, overshadowed by twisted trees and an alien craft. Perhaps one day, the truth will surface in public records. For now, it remains a footnote in hush-hush files, concealed behind the facade of a routine aviation disaster. If you stumble on this testimony, heed it. Don't assume every crash is an accident. Don't assume rescue is always the end of the ordeal. Some tragedies are orchestrated by forces we can neither define nor control. And if you ever see bright lights sweeping across the night sky at impossible speeds, or hear voices in the static that shouldn't be there, remember the story of Flight 317. We were all mere pieces on a board we didn't even know existed. And for reasons unknown, they decided to move us, break us, and put some of us back, like test subjects in a cosmic experiment we may never comprehend. If you stumble on this testimony, heed it. Don't assume every crash is an accident. Don't assume rescue is always the end of the ordeal. Some tragedies are orchestrated by forces we can neither define nor control. And if you ever see bright lights sweeping across the night sky at impossible speeds, or hear voices in the static that shouldn't be there, remember the story of Flight 317. We were all mere pieces on a board we didn't even know existed. And for reasons unknown, they decided to move us, break us, and put some of us back, like test subjects in a cosmic experiment we may never comprehend. Wherever the UFOs roam, wherever those creatures skulk, one fact persists. They are here. They have always been here. And they will continue to prey on anyone who drifts into their sphere of influence. We simply had the misfortune of crossing paths with them. The next time they strike, you might not be lucky enough to walk away with just bruises and nightmares. The forest keeps secrets beyond human reckoning. And in the dark, under swirling storm. Clouds and the hush of broken branches. A monstrous silhouette with too many eyes might be watching, waiting for its chance to drag you into the deepest, blackest void of its domain. Pray you never see those eyes. Never feel that electric hum shudder through your bones, and never hear the radio whisper in a voice that could be your friend's, begging for mercy that never comes. Because once you know that terror, there is no going back to the safe world you believed in. There is only the endless recollection of how fragile we truly are when confronted by the horrors that lurk just beyond the threshold of our understanding.